Welcome to today's colloquium talk on intergenerational dimensions of health inequalities. Today is a particularly special day for us for two reasons. One, of course, is that both our speakers today have played a critical role in shaping the discourse around health inequalities and how they should be addressed, both nationally and globally. And the second is that today's colloquium talk marks the first anniversary of this series on equity and social determinants of health. Since we started this colloquium series, we've had a remarkable set of people speaking on a wide range of issues, but all with a focus on health equity. We started with Professor Gita Sen's a very insightful talk on equity as a social determinant of health. And subsequently, we've discussed the impact of coercion and control on women's health. We've talked about the normalization of violence that accompanies greater mobility for women, the impact of intersecting inequalities on the health of older Indian women, the social determinants of tribal health, and so much more. Some of the topics have been very current. We talked about, for example, the union budget and its implications for gender equity. Some of them have been very philosophical. We talked about the reflections on the politics of knowledge production, especially social knowledge. But all of them have been serious engagements with the topic by academics, researchers, by practitioners, advocates, all deeply engaged in their subject and able to speak about them with authority. All of this, of course, has taken a considerable amount of organizational skill and time, and I really appreciate my team for having pulled it together. For those of you who are attending one of these webinars for the first time, thank you for being here. You can listen, or you can watch some of the previous talks on our YouTube link, which is available on our webpage. We're eagerly looking forward to today's conversation. Our speaker today is Professor Srinath Reddy. He, of course, requires no introduction, but I will try anyway. Many of you might have already read his book, From Pulse to Planet, where he addresses important issues associated with the impact of climate change on health, amongst, of course, many other topics. It's a fascinating read and so effortlessly written. He is the founder and past president of the Public Health Foundation of India, where he is now an honorary distinguished professor. He formerly headed the Department of Cardiology at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences in New Delhi. And he has held or continues to hold innumerable academic and advisory positions in national and international organizations. He has over 570 scientific publications. And in recognition of his massive contribution to the field, he was awarded the Padma Bhushan by the President of India in 2005. His contributions to public health have been recognized through several awards and honors, as well as honorary doctorates from universities across the globe. Thank you for being with us today, Srinath. Our other speaker, we are so privileged to have with us Dr. Gita Sen as our discussant. She also requires no introduction. She is the former director of our center, and she continues to be associated with us as an honorary advisor and distinguished professor. She received her PhD in economics from Stanford University and has honorary doctorates from the universities of East Anglia, Sussex, Edinburgh, Open University, UK, as well as the Karolinska Institute in Sweden. She has had long teaching stints at the IIM Bangalore, at CDS Trivandrum, Vassar College, and is an adjunct professor at the Harvard School of Public Health. She has championed the cause of gender equality through DAWN, Development Alternative with Women for a New Era, a network of women scholars, researchers, and activists from the Global South working towards the enhancement of economic and gender justice and democratic sustainable development. She too has very many feathers in her cap, appointments to national and international policymaking committees and panels, commemorative lectures, keynote addresses, and a mile long list of publications in a very illustrious career. Thank you, Gita, for being with us today. And now over to you, Srinath. No further ado.
Thank you very much. It's certainly a pleasure to be part of this event where the Ramalinga Swami Center is celebrating 1 year of the colloquium series. The Ramalinga Swami Center came to be when Professor Ramalinga Swami's family, which had started the Ramalinga Swami Foundation, approached PHFI to find out whether we had an interest in starting a center which could commemorate his name through an endowment to be provided by the foundation. Professor Prabha Ramalinga Swami was one of the people who was guiding that particular initiative, but there was a formal decision to be taken by a stellar board which consisted of several luminaries. They shortlisted 2 institutions which had some association with Professor Ramalinga Swami. One was the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, which had been blessed to have him as a director for several years, and before that as a renowned pathologist for several years. As the head of the Department of Pathology, as a luminary in the area of nutrition pathology, having found out the causation of Himalayan goiter, there are a number of other areas in which he had accomplished several things, including even in cardiology, where he, along with Sujay Roy, wrote a seminal paper on juvenile mitral stenosis as characteristic of Indian rheumatic heart disease. The second was the Public Health Foundation of India, which was fairly new. There was no institutional affiliation that Rama had, but there was a certain amount of personal engagement with me. I met Rama for the first time when I entered as a postgraduate student of medicine in 1974, the portals of the All India Institute of Medical Sciences. While I was doing my post-graduation, I had the opportunity of assisting him as a rapporteur in a meeting on the reforms needed for medical education in India. And Rama then took me under his wing in a way and tried to mentor me in some ways in terms of my own career development. He did ask me to go to Dundee for a training in the pedagogy of medical education, where a lot of reforms were happening, and possibly come back to a center of medical education to be set up in All India Institute. But I had already committed myself to cardiology, and that remained my interest. But Rama and I continued to engage with each other, and even sometimes in a doctor-patient relationship for some years. So Rama and Mrs. Prabha Ramalinga Swami knew about me, but also Dr. Prabha Ramalinga Swami and the other members of the foundation knew about the vision of PHFI. So when they had to choose between PHFI and All India Institute of Medical Sciences, we thought they would automatically plump for the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, because that was where he had spent so many years of his life and had achieved great renown for his leadership. But the committee, I think also influenced by Mrs. Ramalinga Swami, Professor Prabha Ramalinga Swami, who herself was a professor at JNU in the Department of Social Medicine, felt that PHFI had the vision of broad multidisciplinary education, where many streams of knowledge would be brought in on the public health platform, whereas All India Institute of Medical Sciences would not be able to bring in social sciences in particular to the extent that was needed. It's worth recalling in this context that Rama co-chaired with Professor Nayak the ICSSR committee, which produced a seminal document on the need for bringing in life sciences, medical sciences, and social sciences together in order to advance health. That was when Rama was the Director General of the Indian Council of Medical Research after his stint at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences. So it is that vision that we inherited, not merely through the endowment passed on by the Ramalinga Foundation, but from Rama's own life and leadership. And I'm glad that the Ramalinga Center is now living up to that vision. And this colloquium series is something that really enlivens that commitment that PHFI made to the Ramalinga Foundation when they passed on their financial resources to us and while dissolving themselves. So Rama's spirit lives on through the center. And today I will really try and address the kind of themes that Rama would have liked to listen to. I have chosen for my topic intergenerational dimensions and dynamics of health inequalities. The reasons I will explain, but let me first start with a different story on a personal note, another personal note, on the intergenerational influence on commitment to health equity. My father was born 99 years ago, this month, September. He was a voracious reader, and there was a vast home library which I was exposed to. And one of the books was by R.H. Tawney, a British clergyman, English clergyman, who was also an economist. And Tawney wrote a book titled Equality. In this book, published in 1931, Tawney challenged the established constructs of equality of opportunity and said that what we needed was equality of circumstances, not just an equality of opportunity. To quote Tawney, quote, with massive inequalities, where many are denied an adequate education, unable to access effective healthcare, and housed in slums, equality of opportunity is nothing more than a cruel jest, the impertinent courtesy of an invitation offered to unwelcome guests in the certainty the circumstances will prevent them from accepting it. Now imagine a feudal lord inviting a serf for a possible banquet, but insisting the person must become dressed in a full suit, black tie, and cummerbund. And where would the serf manage that? So essentially, by saying that, by giving this analogy, Tawney was saying equality of opportunity doesn't really bring substance to equity unless we bring in equality of circumstances right from the beginning. So it is that really influenced me substantially as I grew up, and that shaped my vision along with my own father's interpretation of Tawney's work. But coming back to this question of where we are, let me come back to health equity in the context of right to health. We know that the whole idea of how equality, equity, and justice have been debated since the time of Jeremy Bentham, whose utilitarian theory proposed that greatest good for the greatest number should be the guiding principle. That did not necessarily take into account very disadvantaged groups who might have been in a relative minority, but nevertheless required to be provided the benefit of equality, both of circumstances and of opportunity. John Rawls then came up with the theory of justice and then modified it later as justice as fairness. That dominated thinking for several decades with some modifications, but nevertheless, that remained the doctrine. But Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum brought in the concept of capabilities. And Amartya differs in his interpretation of justice and fairness. But they talk in terms of capabilities of nurturing and protecting those capabilities. And indeed, health is one capability which is also nurtured, supported, or hindered by other capabilities which are either developed or hindered. So we are talking about what has been called a meta capability or a cluster of capabilities, as Martha Nussbaum titled it, this particular capability cluster. But I think the definition I like most is that of Sridhar Venkatapuram, who brings all of this discussion together in his book, Health Justice. Quote, a well-ordered society would ensure that all individuals have the capability to be healthy and at a level that is commensurate with human dignity in the modern world, which is their right. So the idea of right to health comes in here essentially as a claim to be supported for developing their capabilities to the fullest possible potential so that they can lead a life with dignity across the life course. But much of this debate, while accepted, both in terms of the rights argument and even in terms of the economic argument of investing in what's called human capital, the discussion is mostly centered around what has happened after birth. For quite some time, we have had debates about nurture versus nature. And biologists insisted on the dominance of nature, whereas social scientists recognize the importance of nurture as shaped by a variety of social forces. Which was the more important, which was the more dominant, which was the one that had a much more overpowering influence on a human life in terms of conduct as well as in terms of health and outcomes. These have been discussed at length, whether in terms of debates on psychology or criminology or elsewhere. But all of them assumed that the script was conveniently divided at the time of birth into the genetic influences which arrived with birth but were determined at the time of conception, and the social determinants of health which started exerting their influence after the individual was born. And all attempts at ameliorating those conditions focused on how those social determinants acted through the life course of that individual, whether a particular social determinant acted alone or much more likely in confluence with many others. So this particular debate advanced over several decades now, but around the turn of the century, we had the human genome, which was discovered, unraveled, or at least revealed. And with that came the very emphatic assertion from geneticists and human biologists that ultimately, since the structure of the gene is mostly known, we can attribute dysfunctions in health to specific gene abnormalities or functions of various genes. And therefore, much of health could be explained in terms of what is causing disease, and many of the interventions would be genetic in nature. Indeed, Francis Collins, a Nobel laureate who headed the National Institutes of Health at that time in the US, one of the most celebrated scientists, went on to say that basically now we had the knowledge to deal with all of the chronic diseases like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, a variety of neurological diseases, even cancers, and put an end to them because now we knew what genetic solutions could be applied. Well, within a very short time, that particular claim has proved to be infructuous because we have seen, firstly, that a large number of genes do not really explain the differences between human beings and between different ethnic groups as to why some are more vulnerable to disease and others are less vulnerable to disease. And even gene therapies have proved far less successful than anticipated or projected. And the explanatory power, particularly for chronic diseases like diabetes and cardiovascular diseases, has been very little, with less than 10% of the variance at best being explained by a conglomerate of multiple candidate genes. So we now know that this is not necessarily true. It is also true that we have seen substantial changes worldwide in how some of these chronic disease epidemics have evolved, whether it is cardiovascular disease or diabetes, or the current modern epidemic of obesity. We have seen how they're mostly manifested from late 19th century through the 20th century to the 21st century now. And even there, we have seen how it has had different geographical patterns, initially in the high-income countries, and there too, initially in the high-income groups, but later on in the lower socioeconomic groups, then in the so-called low and middle-income countries, again, starting with the higher social classes there, but then soon becoming a mass epidemic, engulfing the poor as well. But this progression of the geographic gradient and the reversal of the social gradient have all happened in the last 130, 140 years. The human gene pool has not changed during this time. And therefore, you cannot attribute all of the modern diseases or the diseases of maladapted modernity to genetic causes and thereby claim that by fixing the genes of 8 billion people now, you'll be able to get rid of these diseases. So we now are recognizing the importance of the social determinants. But are the social determinants acting only mostly after birth? And herein comes the whole area of epigenetics. We recognize that both before birth and after birth, while gene structure may not be altered, gene function is certainly altered by exposure to a variety of social determinants. Indeed, NIH, after a few years of toying with the idea of finding genetic solutions for everything, has now begun to invest heavily into epigenetic research, how gene function is modified by exposure to a variety of social determinants. Now you have social epigenomics and environmental epigenomics as important fields that are developing and are being funded substantially. Now, it is here that some of my own work began to address, along with a number of others who were interested in chronic diseases in India. We recognize that in India, there was a high propensity for early onset of cardiovascular disease in relatively young people. And this was something that was noted as a particular predilection, even before we started noting it in India, in migrant Indians. Firstly, in early 1950s, studies were published from what was then Malaya, and later on also in Singapore, showing that compared to the Chinese, the Indians had much more severe and early onset coronary heart disease, suffered myocardial infarctions much more frequently. And then subsequently, in comparison with both Caucasian and African origin persons, in Afro-Caribbeans in particular, in the UK, as well as with other ethnic groups elsewhere in the world, it was very clear that migrant Indians, whatever the time or climb of migration, from first generation to third or fourth generation even, were exhibiting a very high propensity for cardiovascular disease. And that seemed to be driven in particular by a greater propensity for diabetes and pre-diabetes. Now, and this was true of other South Asian countries as well. So before this so-called, what could be possibly called the South Asian sweetheart syndrome, could be explained on the basis of pure genetic patterns. And indeed, that was what was suggested, that this is all genetic. And there was a certain amount of nihilism, which said, we can't do much about it, Indians are genetically prone anyway. It was noticed that Indians had much higher amount of body fat, mostly in the abdomen. This body adiposity and visceral adiposity seem to be very characteristic, and much lower lean muscle mass. And this lean muscle mass being low and the body fat content being high, that was associated with glucose intolerance, with dyslipidemia, with a lot of lipid abnormalities, and all of which led to inflammation, atherosclerosis, thrombosis, much more extensively in the body and much earlier on, with the manifestation of both diabetes and cardiovascular disease and cerebrovascular disease. Now, why was this happening? Was it all because of diet or was it because of other reasons? Now, at this time, David Barker came up with the hypothesis that intrauterine nutrition makes a lot of difference in terms of shaping the manner in which cardiovascular disease and diabetes are determined. Through several studies that he did in UK and then subsequently collaborated with elsewhere, this fetal origins hypothesis came up in a big way. In the book that Srinath has mentioned, I discussed the other theories that preceded and also came alongside, the so-called thrifty gene hypothesis and the drifty gene hypothesis. But this thrifty phenotype hypothesis of David Barker said it doesn't happen for centuries. It's not something that was determined by feast or famine when our ancestors were still emerging from the caves. But it is something that is happening during the 9 months of pregnancy and early childhood. If the mother is undernourished, the child growing in the womb, if it has to survive, it has to conserve energy. And the nervous system being intact is critical for that survival. So everything else becomes secondary. The nutritional resources are diverted to the brain and the nervous system. The lean muscle mass shrinks because otherwise it might burn up a lot of glucose, which is required for the brain for survival. And other organs shrink too, the liver, the lungs, everything else. The child is born small, but has survived. And it is this epigenetic modification in utero that predisposes to later disease, because particularly if in utero you've been undernourished, and in the first 1 or 2 years of life you've been undernourished, then later on, as your nutrition becomes a little more available, may not necessarily be a very large amount of nutrition, but certainly better than being starved, then your body is no longer able to cope with that additional nutrition load, because it has been programmed for a different type of nutrition availability. And then this extra calories, extra nutrition gets converted into body fat, which is particularly stored in the abdomen as a reserve fat for being burnt up. So that is the big challenge. And the lean muscle mass being low, it is insulin resistant, and therefore the insulin cannot act on it to push the sugar inside the muscle as efficiently as in another person. And that's why you get diabetes. So these are the reasons that we now trace back to what happened during pregnancy and early childhood. And our own study in New Delhi, the New Delhi birth cohort, where Professor Shanti Ghosh and Dr. Santosh Bhargava had assembled a cohort of pregnant women, studied them during pregnancy and after birth of the child for 14 years. And then they had documented the birth weights, and then they documented the yearly weights. And we reassembled that cohort later on when the cohort of the babies was about 22, 23 years old, and then followed them up now. And the subsequent generation is also being studied by my colleagues now. And we found that the propensity for diabetes was much more in people who were the babies who were in the lowest quartile of body weight, and in the highest prevalence of impaired glucose tolerance and diabetes was in the subjects who were in the lowest third of the group with respect to body mass index at 2 years, at highest at 12 years. That means they were in the lowest weight category at birth, but at the end of 12 years, they had moved up. They were not obese, but they were relatively obese to themselves at birth. So the question has been, what kind of nutrition supplement should be given to these children in order to prevent them from suffering the disadvantage of poor growth? Should they be given additional nutrition so that they make up for the disadvantage that they had during pregnancy and early childhood? Studies in Chile actually sounded a note of caution. They said, if you try and give additional feeding, nutritional supplementation, because these children have been metabolically programmed, this again gets converted to fat. They're not growing tall, but they're growing fat. And therefore, fat, stunted children were noticed in Chile. So they sounded a caution, saying, do not give additional nutritional supplementation to these children to speed up catch-up growth. But then that poses a huge question. Are we denying these children the opportunity for physical and cognitive growth so that they can actually regain some opportunities? Or are we going to prevent them in the fear that they're going to acquire diabetes and cardiovascular disease because of this kind of epigenetic programming? I believe the answer lies in finding the right kind of balanced diet, because unfortunately, much of the diets that we are forcing on these children is not nurturing diet. It's full of carbohydrates, refined sugars, it's full of ultra-processed foods. So what is the kind of balanced diet and physical activity pattern? Because physical activity reduces insulin resistance of the skeletal muscle. So what is the right combination of the balanced diet and appropriate physical activity, which can reduce the insulin resistance, refashion the epigenetic mechanisms of gene expression, and allow them to grow to their physical and cognitive potential? These are questions that need to be asked and answered. And we are trying to get the Indian Council of Medical Research to do studies on this, because otherwise we'll be condemning these children to great disadvantage in their life. So this is where, so with respect to their body mass index at 2 years and comparing at 12 years, this was the change. They were in the lowest category at 2 years, and they were in the highest category at 12 years. And this rebound adiposity, as it is called, was the danger signal. Now, therefore, the next question comes up is this something only because of nutrition that we are seeing this kind of epigenetic prenatal modification of gene expression? No. We know that it's happening with tobacco. We have realized that tobacco is a great cause of poverty because of multiple reasons, because people spend their money. Firstly, the poor consume tobacco much more than higher social classes. They spend money on purchasing, they spend money on healthcare, they lose wages, and the death of the wage earner further sinks the family into poverty. Now, all of these are important elements. And instead of spending money on nutrition, education, and living environment of the children, the smoker or the tobacco consumer is actually consigning them to great disadvantage. But that is a social determinant after birth. But what happens in terms of before birth? In terms of before birth, in 2006 in China, India and Thailand, okay, now let me come to the impact on, let me come to the impact on tobacco on poverty during the life period. Spending on tobacco diverts and steals income from food and education. A study in Philippines showed that the poorest households were spending more on tobacco than on education, health, and clothing combined. In 2006 in China, India, and Thailand, cost of 20 cigarettes was at least double that of 1 kg of rice. And in Vietnam, in households with smokers, expenditure on cigarettes was 1.5 times that on education, 1/3 of that on food, and 5 times of that on healthcare. Now, that is what happens when tobacco drives poverty and lack of development during the lifetime. But what about the health inequalities that are arising because of conditioning, because of tobacco, which has epigenetic manifestations? Nicotine can induce changes in the methylation, which is an epigenetic modification of gene expression, DNA methylation. It can induce changes in methylation of more than 7,000 genes. These modifications can be preserved for more than 3 decades after exposure. So if my mother has been smoking, or my father has subjected my mother to passive smoking in a great deal, and I have been exposed in utero to the tobacco smoke, or my mother has been chewing tobacco, then the nicotine would have created epigenetic changes that can last at least up to 30 years of my life. Now, air pollution also has several hazardous chemicals in it. And even with tobacco, there are several other hazardous chemicals, just not nicotine. I only mentioned nicotine, but all the other hazardous chemicals also can cause epigenetic changes. And several of those chemicals are present in air pollution. Particulate matter 2.5, particulate matter 10, aromatic polycyclic hydrocarbons, persistent organic pollutants. All of these, air pollution can have a huge amount of exposure risks to people. Now, what happens in pregnancy? Studies on air pollution and birth weight showed that as interquartile exposure to nitric dioxide, carbon monoxide, PM10, and PM2.5 increased during pregnancy, birth weight decreased. Now, This is a study in 2019 from Guangdong, China, published in BMC Public Health. Based on this study, another study was conducted in California. This was in Hispanic women in Los Angeles, in California, a cohort study published in JAMA in 2022. Early to mid-pregnancy exposures to PM2.5, PM10, nitrogen dioxide were associated with low birth weight. And there have been several other supportive studies as well. So we now know that there is a challenge, even prenatally, in terms of epigenetic changes. So there is an intergenerational communication of severe disadvantage to child growth and development because of prenatal exposures, which will be exacerbated by tobacco consumption in and around the child as the child grows later on because of a number of social factors that affect child's growth and nurturing. So we see this confluence of pre and postnatal influences of both epigenetic and what we can call social determinants of health associated with conditions that are often associated with poverty. Now, we see that there are other elements also that are coming in. Even the microbiome, which is predominantly determined by the kind of foods that we eat, also can cause some interactions between genes and can also influence the epigenetic modifications. Climate change can do that. Prolonged stress can do that. And we know fully well that poverty induces a huge amount of stress. And poor people, even when we talk about air pollution, it is the poor people who have to do work outside in the fields or other kind of daily wage labor are much more exposed to air pollution. Even when we talk of climate change, heat exposure is much more to the poorer sections of the population. And therefore, we are seeing that poverty had induced through nutritional deprivation, epigenetic changes, and that is further exacerbated by adverse social circumstances as the child grows. And unfortunately, this may not be confined to one generation. We know that particularly in terms of nutritional epigenetic modification, during pregnancy, if the child in the womb is a female child, and then she has eggs or oocytes in that fetus, then the epigenetic modifications can affect those eggs as well. So not only is the child that's going to be born, but the child that will be born to her later on will also be affected because of this chain of epigenetic modifications continuing to influence health. So not only the child yet to be born, but the child yet to be conceived is blighted in this manner by intrauterine malnutrition. And that will happen also with other environmental exposures like air pollution, climate change. All of these are going to be happening. We know that mothers exposed to extreme heat are likely to have low birth weight children. Or mothers exposed to prolonged stress are likely to have low birth weight children. So this is a confluence of social determinants influencing epigenetic mechanisms before birth, and then further aggravated by social determinants as the life course continues. So we know that we can modify the epigenetics, and the epigenetics are modifiable even during the lifetime, but that requires reconditioning of the social determinants, of the social environment, giving an opportunity for correction of the disadvantages, whether in terms of nutrition, or whether in terms of physical activity, or whether in terms of avoiding tobacco, or in terms of getting a greater opportunity for pleasurable and safe physical activity. All of these are going to be important elements which will actually help us reverse some of the effects that were prenatally determined by epigenetic modification. So we are having to really reconfigure our social systems so that we can prevent some of these epigenetic changes that have happened before birth, and certainly ensure that there is no further damage inflicted as the children grow up. And we owe it to them to do it in both manners. And that's why when we really talk about intergenerational communication of disadvantage, it is not only because the parents have been poor, they've been less educated, they've had less opportunities, that the child also has great disadvantage. That certainly is very true. But some of these disadvantages actually started even before the child has been born. And some of these disadvantages may continue even when the child becomes a parent to the children that the parent is going to get. And therefore, this whole chain has to be interrupted by a very conscious attempt to correct the kind of social conditions that have created this inequality of circumstances, as Tony puts it. And then we have to make sure that there is equality of opportunities as the child grows. So just the one or the other is not going to help. And that's where our task lies in refashioning a healthy society. Let me close by quoting Rudolf Virchow. Virchow is another hero of mine. Rudolf Virchow was a famous pathologist of the 19th century, a contemporary of Bismarck. And he was what could be called a senator in the court of the Emperor of Prussia, a very renowned pathologist who found out the causes of thrombosis. A number of things in pathology are named after him, the Virchow's triad, and even now it goes by his name. But Virchow was sent by the emperor to investigate an outbreak of typhus in Upper Silesia, in what was then Prussia, which is now Germany. And Virchow came back after spending time there, not with a biological or a microbiological diagnosis, which he was adept at, of course, but with a damning social indictment. He said the entire thing is attributed to extreme poverty. He wanted unlimited democracy. He wanted abolition of feudal privileges. He wanted the poor to be helped so that they are no longer susceptible to these kind of infectious diseases. For that, he lost his position in the royal court. But he became the founder of social medicine. He started the Anthropological Society of Germany. And his intellectual contributions are remarkable. I'll only quote one from his several sayings, from his writings. Quote, "Do we not always find the diseases of the populace traceable to defects in society? If disease is an expression of individual life under unfavorable circumstances, then epidemics must be indicative of mass disturbances." He said these are mass disturbances of artificial culture. What he really meant was that society is really changing the way it is structured and it's functioning, and creating a free rein to forces that are altering the way we live and the way we are forced to live. And that is creating the settings in which outbreaks will occur. What was true of typhus infection then is true of tobacco now. It is also true of ultra-processed foods, which undermine health in utero. They also cause epigenetic modifications. They undermine health after birth. So imagine the child who has been disadvantaged and epigenetically conditioned in utero because of poor nutrition. Now is being fed a lot of ultra-processed food, a lot of refined carbohydrates, in the false belief that this is going to help the child to grow well. and then you're going to have a physiological backlash in terms of abdominal fat, but still lean muscle mass and a stunted obese child. So we have to really recognize all of these connections, give up some of these false dichotomies between nature and nurture, but recognize that social determinants act both prenatally and postnatally, and try and restructure our society in a manner that will actually provide every child an opportunity to be born healthy and grow healthy. So my own book, which Srilata referred to, I'll just quote concluding paragraphs from that. The benefits of health promotion at the societal level will extend across several generations by creating the legacy of healthy habitats, which are free of environmental pollution and tobacco smoke, while providing dietary diversity through nutrition-friendly agriculture and food systems. The growth of healthy cities must provide opportunities for safe social interaction and physical activity without destroying forests or disturbing ecological balance. Intergenerational carriage of benefits of health promotion is mediated through pathways that involve both epigenetic effects and social system design. Such long-term benefits are seldom estimated in conventional economic evaluation of initiatives for health promotion, because you only discuss what's going to happen in the next 5 years or 10 years. But what's going to happen when you create a smoke-free public place, an exercise-friendly community area, or ensure that you have healthy foods available in a diverse diet with ultra-processed foods heavily regulated or eliminated, and tobacco-free societies are created, then those benefits are going to be lasting for generations ahead as well. So those are the economic benefits that also need to be estimated. Yet such intergenerational benefits are of the greatest value for societal well-being, even if they're not fully counted in. So I believe that the argument for sustainability must take into account the creation of healthy societies, and we must ensure that health justice begins even before the child is born, but certainly be assured after the child is born. Thank you.
Thank you, Srinath, for a very insightful talk, and also for educating us on the history of our center and walking us through such an evidence-based, look into the epigenetic foundations for either health or well-being, ill health or well-being later on in life. You often hear about ill health being ascribed to either bad luck, bad genes, or bad behavior. But I think you've given us a lot of insight into other factors that actually are much more important. Thank you so much. Gita, please, the floor is yours.
You have me sort of struggling for words to try and figure out in which way to address what, to use your own words, is probably, you gave us a damning indictment of health policies, health systems, and larger economic policies that quite often underpin or don't underpin bad policies and don't underpin the kind of changes that we need. The stark connection, the picture that you paint of now with so much evidence. Probably 3 decades ago, we could have, sort of said, well, we don't really know. Now it's very clear that people like yourself and others who've been working in this field have a mountain of evidence about the way in which poverty, through epigenetic changes, reproduces intergenerationally. via ill health, via deprivations, via lack of both opportunities and circumstances, and that therefore wringing one's hands about and saying, has poverty gone up or down a little bit in this generation, is not going to cut the ice in terms of this. And by the way, while you were speaking about Tawny, I couldn't resist looking up the Anatole France quote from his novel. Anatole France, for those of you who are not as old as Srinath and I, was a 19th and early 20th century French Nobel Prize winning novelist, poet, and so on. And his quote, he said, "The law in its majestic equality forbids rich and poor alike to sleep under bridges, to beg in the streets, and to steal their bread." And this was, of course, from his novel, The Red Lily. And it's perfectly, yes, equality of opportunity simply is not enough. As you said, Tawny pointed out. I'm not going to engage, because I don't have the training to engage with the biomedical evidence that you put forward, except to say that, as I said, that now nobody can claim that we don't know that this translates. It's not just, as Shweta said, it doesn't just translate because the poor make bad choices, they make bad decisions, and so on. It's translating through the fetus, it's translating through oocytes, and that then means across generations. And so that means if you really want to eradicate this kind of poverty, it requires digging much deeper into the structures that are reproducing it. I think it is, the implications of what you said are particularly poignant because in your own book, The Pulse to Planet, you have, and I share that with you, such a strong faith in young people. And is this what we're doing to our young people? Condemning them to die early of diabetes and cardiovascular, untreated diabetes and cardiovascular diseases, in addition to the stresses of unemployment and everything else. And I think that makes it even more poignant because you and I and our generation has done such a god-awfully rotten job of protecting the planet and staying within planetary boundaries that we rely on the next generations to be able to do that for us. But it's not just a question of what planet are we giving them, it's what microbiome are we giving them? What is it that, that is being transferred to them? I want, therefore, to step back one step further from where you are to something which at the beginning I was saying I was sort of ruminating over at a workshop in the last couple of days. We all know about the explosion of inequality both in the country in the last couple of decades and in the world as well. And it's inequalities of different kinds, rich, poor, rich countries versus poorer ones, rich people versus poorer people. I remember when I was a young faculty member at CDS in Trivandrum, talking with Professor K.N. Raj at that time. And he would tell us, and of course, you know, he could reel off evidence and data about economics from anywhere. And he would say, you know, at least India doesn't have the Brazil type of inequality. Well, that was then. That was the 1980s. India now not only has, but probably is surpassing the Brazil type of inequality in a country that is much lower in per capita incomes and much worse in poverty levels. But where is this coming from? Where is this explosion of inequality coming from that in fact is associated then with the making the policy struggles against poverty so much more difficult at this time than they were, let's say, in the 70s or even in the 80s. And to my mind, there's no question but that what is happening right now is very much a product of financialization. If we look, and let me say why, let me just sort of say a little bit about why I think this is the case. This is not just globalization and liberalization, though they were the first waves in India since the 1990s, in many countries since the 1980s onwards. They were the first wave of what we're now seeing by way of financialization and the rapid sort of ballooning of financial wealth and financial markets. And let me put it to you simply in this way. Let me ask a question. Has it ever occurred to anybody in the audience, how is it possible for, and I'm not mentioning any names here, but how is it possible for wealth to plummet, somebody's wealth to plummet from $500 billion to $30 billion overnight because the stock markets collapsed? What does that mean, actually? Does it mean factories have disappeared? Does it mean, you know, infrastructure has gone away? Does it mean, what does it mean that wealth has been destroyed? This destruction of financial wealth, akin to the creation of financial wealth, is actually only a claim on wealth. It's the struggle between the financiers and the productive side of the economy over wealth. Who gets to claim wealth? And the financiers have discovered a way to lay claim to the productive wealth in the economy through financial securities, stocks, bonds, derivatives, and so on and so forth. It's not real in the same way that a factory is real, or that a farm is real, or that a go-down is real. But it is a very, very powerful claim. That claim is what is ballooning out or eroding. And one might say, well, what's wrong with that? What harm does it do? The harm that it does is that it has then suborned all of macroeconomic and state policy. Macroeconomic policy in the 1970s and even 1980s used to have two, maybe I won't get into the third target: full employment and controlling inflation. And there was a balance of payments goal as well, which we don't need to worry about. Do you ever hear anybody talking about full employment as a goal? It's all inflation targeting. And why inflation targeting? Because all of policy has been taken over by the financial sector. Why is inflation targeting important for the financial sector? Because you have to control inflation in order to make it possible for your money not to lose its value. Therefore, if I want to move money around from here to there, from this country to that country, if I want to quickly move my money in or out, I don't want to lose it because inflation has messed up the exchange rates. That's the primary reason for all of this inflation targeting. It's to keep money at the same value that it's all that and keep that stable. In the interest of that stability, we get inflation targeting, and inflation targeting means fiscal control and fiscal austerity. Stop governments from overspending. So what we've ended up with is completely turning Keynesian policies on their heads. The money makers, the financial markets have won. But the result of this, you might ask a different question. So if I'm the financier whose claims on real wealth have ballooned because I have all these stocks and securities and so on, is somebody else hurting because of this? Yes, somebody else is hurting. Who is hurting are those people, essentially workers who now cannot get paid. Workers who will not get paid real wages that are the same. So you see a precipitous decline. Somebody has to be squeezed when someone else is grabbing wealth in this way. And that tends to be the lower ends of the spectrum. So governments cannot spend on health policies, education policies, water supply, sanitation, housing, and you name it. They cannot support maternity care. They cannot support childcare. They cannot support, all of the services that are needed for people. When healthcare costs rise and health spending shrinks, it means that women in the home are doing that much more unpaid healthcare, because people can no longer afford paid healthcare because health services have been cut. Health service costs are too much. So we're talking about a kind of the financial deadweight balloon sitting on top of the real economy that in fact is making it impossible for governments to do anything by way of supporting the kind of attention to intergenerational health that all of your work is pointing to, Srinath, and all of the evidence that your work is pointing to. So we will never get those kinds of changes unless we can tackle this one, because this one is generating all of the inequality at this, almost all of the inequality at this point that has been ballooning. This is the one that is actually in country after country. And the most striking evidence of this was that during 2 years of the pandemic, 2020, 2021, 22, when everybody and their grandmother, I might say, had agreed that governments, international agencies, everybody needed to invest in building up health systems. Over 100 countries, up to I think 120 or 130 countries, were undergoing austerity policies enforced by the IMF. And with those kinds of austerity policies, you cannot fund health, let alone funding primary health care. You cannot fund. Austerity policies will prevent any money going towards health or education or any of the services that we think are critical. And that is at the peak of the pandemic, when, I mean, you would think if they would at least hide their thing under a bushel at that point and say, let it go. But the IMF was enforcing austerity because countries were reeling under both the economic shock and the health shock of the pandemic. So they were going to the IMF and the private markets for borrowing. And the conditionalities for that was austerity. You don't get to spend that money any way you please. You only get to spend it in order to make sure that the debt is repaid properly, and more of the real resources of the economy are shifted towards those who are laying claim on it through the financial market. So I think that in a sense, it's hard, just as it's hard for an economist to really understand the nature of how poverty is being reproduced intergenerationally through epigenetics. I often find that it's difficult for health people to understand how, in fact, health is being eroded through what is happening in the economy. I'm not making an argument against capitalism as a whole or something. There are arguments to be made about that, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about what has happened in the last 3 decades or so. We did not have Gini coefficients of inequality of the kind that we have in this country in the 1980s. And that must mean something. That means somebody is hurting. And we know who is hurting. And it is reinforced by jobless growth. There are no jobs for young people. So these young people on whom you and I so deeply believe and hope really require a fairer shake in terms of both the epigenetics and in terms of the economics of the world that we are giving them. Let me stop with that.
Thank you, Gita. I think that for many of us, the macroeconomics that underlie under-resourcing of health that we all weep about all the time is not always clear, but I think you explained it very cogently just now. And I wonder, Srinath, if you would like to respond to that, because some of the questions that Gita has raised, especially the last one, about what is the legacy that we have left for the next generation, for the adolescents, in terms of what the health sector looks like, health policies look like today, what could possibly be done to kind of to help at this point?
Well, I completely agree with Gita. Indeed, the whole area of austerity has really hurt many populations and countries across the world. And if we're going to have jobless growth, that's not going to really help. Angus Deaton wrote an article recently on how Keynes has been misinterpreted, and that has led to disasters. Entirely agreed. That is the whole idea of how economic investments should be made in promoting people's welfare has been completely forgotten. And I may say that economic policies and financial markets have been epigenetically modified by investor greed. And that is a huge challenge that we have. And we need to correct those factors as well. So I believe that when we are really talking about health or education or other elements of human development, we have to recognize that ultimately it is the political and economic systems that we are operating in and the choices that we make with respect to that will drive everything else. So that is where I believe younger people also will have to be made familiar with that. Already there is a pushback on environment and other areas, but unless they also understand what are all the drivers that are distorting societal development, they will probably not be able to focus their energies on challenging them to the extent they should. Because even the financial markets will have their own heroes. They have their own adulators in the media, which is often purchased. And then, therefore, the public, including the young, will not get to know many of these either as facts or as concepts in order to engage in an informed debate. It's necessary for us also to raise these issues so that the young can really make the right kind of diagnosis before they start applying their own cures.
There are several questions in the Q&A I'd like to get to before we run out of time. I think your explanation of epigenetics has certainly, provoked a lot of interest because it was so sort of revealing. And a couple of questions around specific types of exposures that might impact growth. But one particular question on whether epigenetics can impact growth even, in adolescence and later. And what does that really mean in terms of, policy and building programs towards addressing some of these changes that might have taken place even before, pre-birth?
Well, epigenetics can actually be modified at any stage in life. How long some of the epigenetic changes persist is still being studied. But the fact that modification is possible even during the lifetime is something that people believe in, and it's happening. After all, if, for example, the microbiome, which Gita also referred to, is changed by our diets, and the products of the microbiome also affect epigenetic expression, or if we have a very stressful life and are sleep deprived, and that has an epigenetic effect, if we can change that, then there will be some degree of redressal. But how much are the epigenetic changes going to last for decades? That still is a matter of study. But we believe that they're potentially modifiable. Because if environmental exposures are causing changes in gene expression, then other environmental exposures which are more conducive to good health can alter the gene expression and possibly give greater opportunity during further cell replication for the epigenetically better programmed genes to become more dominant over time.
I see. So that certainly is some ray of hope. And one of the questions we have is also about whether, and you're very familiar with our antenatal care programs and so on, and if it is during that period that that these kinds of alterations are taking place, what should, if there were three things that you would suggest to, either strengthen or change the direction of this antenatal care program that we have in place, would it be possible through such a program to make a difference? And if so, what would those things be?
Antenatal period is a very critical period, but as Gita and everybody else who have been studying women's health knows, much of the problem starts even when you have a girl child. Before the girl child grows to be an adolescent girl and then a mother. Because if you are undernourished during that period of growth, you'll have a small pelvis. If you have a small pelvis, your placenta will be small. Your placental blood flow will be small. And therefore, the child will be born small. So you have to start correction much earlier. But you have to correct at every possible stage. The nutrition and growth of the girl child is very important. Avoiding early pregnancy is important. Giving a fully balanced diet is very important, not just a few supplements. Those are some of the, and ensuring that some of the noxious exposures, when you have an underfed woman working in a kitchen with biomass fuels surrounded by smoke, then that certainly is not going to help the pregnancy outcomes or the epigenetic mechanisms. So ensuring that we have nutrition as well as other living conditions configured for a healthy carry-through pregnancy is going to be an important element. So those are some of the things that need to be brought in. And of course, I would say that a very balanced, nutritious diet is absolutely critical rather than just a few supplements.
But given that some of these things that you're pointing to are much larger than any one program can deliver naturally, and also any advice cannot really be put into practice because of the circumstances, as you yourself mentioned, the inequality of circumstances makes it impossible for people to be able to, for example, live in an environment which is free of indoor air pollution or, one of those kinds of effects. Is our antenatal care program then, in the short term, is it really going to accomplish much? It has accomplished certainly, better outcomes for mother and child, but is, in the long term, in terms of some of the things that you have been mentioning, how can it, is it only a cause for despair, as some people are asking, is it a depressing future that we're looking at until the larger macroeconomic issues are taken care of?
I'm not saying that it's ineffective. I'm only saying it's incomplete. So we have to address many other elements alongside that. So, now, are we giving enough fruit and vegetables to the pregnant mother? At least the antioxidants in that will counteract some of the noxious elements in the environmental tobacco smoke or environmental smoke from the kitchen. Ideally, she should avoid much of the exposure to that smoke. But at least are we helping her to counteract some of that with a nutritious diet? Those are some of the questions that we need to ask ourselves. So what's our policy there?
One of the questions is interesting. I think maybe both you and Gita might want to weigh in on this. One of the questions has to do with why, you had not mentioned Michael Marmot in your talk, and whether that was by design, and perhaps do you feel that the political positioning of social determinants of health has shifted since he, did his work on the social determinants of health, and what is your opinion on that? And I would like to hear from Gita as well on this particular issue.
The foreword of my book is written by Michael Marmot.
Yes.
Sir Michael Marmot. So I'm not shying away from Michael. And I did not mention Michael. Michael's work is well known. And Michael has focused on social determinants through the life course. The subject of my talk was mostly on the determinants prior to the person enters life. So the intergenerational impact. The intergenerational impact of social determinants is known. If your mother and father are poorly educated, if they're income deprived, they're facing social stresses of migration or discrimination, those social determinants are going to rub off on you anyway. But what I was trying to bring in is, there are social determinants even prenatally through biological mechanisms, which then interact with the social determinants as the person grows up, and that, unless those are also addressed, then the impact of those epigenetic modifications will get further aggravated. So I completely swear by Michael. I've served with him on the Commission on Social Determinants for Health for the Eastern Mediterranean region of WHO. And then I regard him as one of my mentors. So I'm not disowning Michael, certainly not. But in the context of my talk, he did not feature him. I was not going through all the pantheon of my heroes.
Gita, what would you say about Srinath's expansion of his of his argument?
Albeit from me to get in between Srinath Reddy and Michael Marmot, I wouldn't dare. However, while of course I have enormous respect for Michael Marmot's work and the tenacity with which he was able to get the field to recognize that the importance of seeing inequality as a gradient based on all of the evidence that was emerging. And then, of course, as the chair of the WHO Commission on Social Determinants of Health. However, I will not deny that I will always in the sense that the inequality that he saw has almost always been, I don't know what he would say now, but I don't see it reflected enormously in anything, was economic inequality between rich and poor. So things like gender inequality and so on almost never have made it into his work in a serious way. And that, I think, is a serious loss for somebody who is talking about the great importance of thinking about inequality itself as a social determinant of health, which is what a lot of his work leads to. But it's always about rich and poor, the better off and the worse off. And not about how gender inequality and other forms of ascriptive, what you might call ascriptive inequalities of different kinds, whether by race or by caste or by whatever else, how those play out and how those intersect with economic inequality. And I think that, his work in that sense definitely needs to be complemented, supplemented, added to by that.
If I may pitch in again, Michael's own work his understanding and his articulation have evolved over the last 3 decades. He started off, of course, with the civil servant study and then a number of other studies like that in the UK, where he showed the social class differences and status differences and many others, and followed it up. But in the WHO Determinants, the Macroeconomics Commission, the question of inequality did come in a big way, and the various social determinants were identified. But he was a little shy of talking about neoliberal economic policies. Now he talks very vocally about neoliberal economic policies because he has seen what has happened in the last 2 decades. And he is now advising the Labour Party in the UK in their articulation of policies, and particularly in terms of what Gita referred to as this whole austerity business. He is definitely countering that. Therefore, even Michael Dewar, in terms of his understanding and openness of some of the major structural defects in the economic policies that are currently holding forth in many of these countries.
I think we have run out of time, and that was actually a very good note on which to end after having got both your views on really what are the critical social determinants of health, and how does it relate to the analysis of epigenetics that Srinath had shared throughout his talk. My apologies for the people whose questions that we were not able to get to, but we will try and see if we can share those questions and perhaps get a response in some other way. But thank you very much again, both Gita and Srinath, for a wonderful talk and a wonderful conversation after the talk as well. Thank you very much.